Welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay respects to leaders past, present and emerging. The Understanding Boys podcast is a series of conversations exploring what it is to be a good man these days. So if you had a story about being a good man and that you could tell a 14-year-old boy and he'd actually listen, what would that story be? And that's really what I'm asking our guests today. I'm Dr Ray Swann, and we're a community of teachers and parents concerned with the education and growth of boys in the modern world. The series is brought to you by Brighton Grammar, an all-boys school in Melbourne. To learn more about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. In today's podcast, we speak to Reverend Tim Costello. Tim was the Chief Advocate and former CEO of World Vision Australia, where he has been instrumental in ensuring that issues surrounding global poverty were placed on the national agenda. Prior to this, Tim served as President of the Baptist Union of Australia, Minister of Collins Street Baptist and St Kilda Baptist Churches, and was the Executive Director of Urban Seed, a Christian non-for-profit outreach service for the urban disadvantaged. Tim has also authored a number of books, including Another Way to Love, Streets of Hope, Finding God in St Kilda, and Hope. In 2004, Tim was named Victorian of the Year. In 2015, he was made an Officer of the Order of Australia and was named Victorian Australian of the Year in 2006. Welcome, Tim, to the podcast. It's great to have you here today.
It's an absolute honour to be with you, Ray.
Thank you. Well, I thought a good place to get started was talking, I guess, on what you've been doing most recently, which is your work in humanitarianism for the last 18 years or so. And I guess the first question I had for you was, how you see humanitarianism. Is it part of our civic duty for us to donate, to advocate for those less prosperous than ourselves? And I guess as part of that, how do we encourage our kids to move beyond just simply knowing about it to actually doing something about it?
Yeah, I think it goes to our fundamental human nature with the question of what does it mean to be human. I would answer that humans are wired for empathy. Sometimes it's out of shock and self-interest. What if that was me that was thrown up on the stage of life called Mozambique, where the cyclones have just hit and 1 million people are homeless and hungry? Or in East Timor, where I don't have a guarantee of universal health, universal education, clean water, and yet it's an hour's flight from Melbourne. So I think humans, to be truly human, have to explore their empathy. And once you empathise, the next question is there something I can do about this? Is there something I should do about this? That's the ethical question, the should. Mm-hmm. And I think if you deny that journey of what can I do and what should I do, I can't save everyone, I can maybe make a difference, I think it's living consequentially with the best of your human nature. So I think humanitarianism is wired into our human species. In rights terms, it's the idea that human rights are universal and indivisible. So injustice somewhere is injustice anywhere. In my faith terms, it's humans all carry the image of God, even if they're disabled, even if they're the wrong sexuality, the wrong caste, the wrong tribe, they still carry the image of God. And, for me, from a faith perspective, it is, can I see the image of God in someone who is not in my image? I don't like their religion or their ethnicity or their political views. Can I still see the image of God in them? So whether you frame it in secular language or in religious language, I think it's profoundly human.
Mm. And with that connection for young people, even whether it was with your own, with your own kids, you were talking earlier about your son who's now, again, like you, exploring a life of service potentially. What are some things that you've seen work in terms of helping kids to really make that connection into that more profound part of who they are? I mean, I'm thinking with what's happening in Mozambique, I imagine it's been quite difficult to get media exposure, with everything that's happening in the AFL, which it seems so trivial and trite. How is it that we can, encourage our young people and our young men in particular to really take a stand and actually connect to that part of themselves which actually helps them to be more humane?
One of the most important things for young people is to take them out of their bubble, and we all live in bubbles, and for them to be exposed to kids, young people their own age. And immediately they go, why is there poverty like this? How can they endure this? If this was me, I may not survive. And how can there be kids my age dying of preventable diseases when we know how to treat these diseases? Dying of dirty water when we know how to do clean water? Dying because they can't get enough calories to survive when the world has more than enough food. So once you're out of your bubble and you take kids on an exposure trip, I think the rest starts to flow. You mentioned my son, who set up a charity and ran it from the age of 24 to 34. It was called YGAP, Youth Generation Against Poverty. He started social businesses, a restaurant called Feast of Merit in Richmond, and Kinfolk in the CBD, and from the proceeds backed young entrepreneurs in Cambodia, in Rwanda. I'd say to parents, kids rarely do what you tell them. My kids never did. They never did. Funnily enough, kids...
Did you though, Tim?
I never did either. Kids rarely do what their parents tell them.
And so it goes.
Funnily enough, they often end up doing what their parents do. I think for parents, modelling empathy and generosity is actually more profound than wagging the finger and telling. So that would be my advice to parents.
That's wonderful advice. You were saying earlier about looking at humanitarianism from the perspective of this, or whether it's secular or faith-based. I wanted to ask you a question about your life of faith, and I guess from an outsider's perspective, people probably assume that your faith has always been unwavering, it's the bedrock and so on. But I guess in these times, and with the work that you see across the world, whether it's in Mozambique or elsewhere, how do you draw inspiration, or from where do you draw inspiration and find renewal in faith? And perhaps how can we help young people to also find renewal or even discovery in faith?
Yeah, faith always, in my experience, has doubt as its twin. Every day I have doubts. I don't think the opposite of faith is doubt. I think the opposite of faith is fear. Fear of others, fear of difference, fear that I'm never going to have enough money, so I'm going to hang on to it, I'm going to be greedy. I think fear is the opposite of faith. In fact, in the Bible, 365 times it says, fear not, be not afraid. Far more than it says God is love and other things. So I think fear is the enemy of faith. After the Christchurch massacre, the day after I was giving a speech, there were federal ministers there, Greg Hunt and other candidates. And I quoted Gandhi. Gandhi said, we think hate is the enemy. It's not. It's fear. Fear that with the Christchurch terrorist, there's a great replacement going on, and my race, the white race, is being replaced and I've got to fight back. Fear leads to hate. So for me, the nourishing of my faith is really the neutralising of my deepest fears. In the Hebrew Bible, what we Christians call the Old Testament, 36 times the Jewish people are told to love the stranger, which we translate the refugee, far more than to love your neighbour or even to love God. Why? Because God's face is seen in the stranger. This idea that I see God's face in someone who's not in my image and overcome my fears of difference, my fear. So faith for me in humanitarian work is very fundamental. It's in my faith that God loves the world. It starts with love, that God created the world and declared it good. It's good. But then the paradox that there's bad things in the world. There are bad people. There are things I'm afraid of. And in our development work, we're always between those bookends, that the world is good, people carry the image of God, and people do bad things, whether it's corruption, whether it's cultural blindness to people who are in a lower caste, so they're not human, or the wrong tribe, and overcoming that fear with the resources of faith. Now, it doesn't have to be my faith, but it does need to be a faith that gives you a sense of meaning, that I am blessed, I can share, I can make a difference, I can overcome my fears and prejudices and need to be superior and stand on the shoulders of others to get ahead. That's what faith is for me.
It was just as you were talking, I was thinking, I think it was Victor Hugo who said, talking about the image, seeing the image of God in others, and I think it was Victor Hugo who said something like, to love another person is to see the face of God.
Beautiful, isn't it? Yeah, it's fear that stops us from seeing them. We see them as the enemy. The world's profoundly re-tribalising at the moment, and we have President Trump will make America great, and President Putin will recover the greatness of Mother Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, even President Erdogan of Turkey, and the humiliation that Turkey was the seat of the caliphate and had an empire, the Ottoman Empire, and will make it great again. And I'm very proud to be Australian. I love Australia. I want Australia to win in the cricket without using sandpaper. But I don't think that's patriotic, but I don't think that Australia, that I happen to love, is just the best and has to prove it's the best over others. I was in Germany for the G20, and I was watching a whole lot of leaders with their nationalistic messages, and it hit me. You'd never hear a German chancellor ever say, "Let's make Germany great again." They would know whose voice they were hearing, and they knew that nationalism, prestigious competition that we're the greatest, leads to war. So I think understanding the profound interconnection of all humans, love of place, but not a thumping, we're better, and we'll show you, is walking that fine line.
I listened to your comments, your oration, the Gandhi Oration, which was superb, and we'll include a link to it because I think people will be very interested to hear it. One of the things you talked about in the oration was Australia's role in giving and relatively, how little we give per capita in comparison to other developed nations. And I have to say, I did wince. So it wasn't something that I was aware of, because I always thought it's part of who we are, that we care for our mates and, we look after others and we lend a hand to those that have fallen. Yeah. But that's not really borne out, I don't think, in the statistics.
No. Well, two things are going on. One is with the re-tribalising, we're saying we'll just look after ourselves, not the world's poor. We've got our own problems. And it sort of is a leave pass. If I had $1 for every time a person said, okay, you're generous to people overseas. Charity begins at home. The subtext is, and it ends at home. If I had $1 for every time someone has said that to me, I'd be a millionaire now. Curiously, when I question people about that, I find they're not doing much at home anyway. It's quite a leave pass. So that re-tribalising is going on with private giving. Look, in the Gandhi lecture, I was particularly talking about Australia's level of Australian aid. We often call it foreign aid. Our promise was 0.7%. That's 70 cents and $100. Britain's legislated that and been doing it for years. The Scandinavian countries are at 0.8%. That's 80 cents and $100. The Dutch at 90 cents. What's Australia at? 22 cents, 0.22, the lowest ever in our history. And I made the point that being generous in our aid program wasn't left or right. It was highest under Bob Menzies when it was 0.5%. And we're a lot richer nation now than under Bob Menzies. And the world's poor are still waiting and dying and hurting because Australia's aid has been cut. We're recording this on budget night, We've been promised if there's a surplus, we'll look at repairing the aid budget. I think the world's poor are still going to be waiting. Australia, the government, has given itself a leave pass here, and I really don't know how we became this mean, this fearful, turning inwards. And people say, oh, you can't look after our poor here and, look after the overseas world's poor. Well, Britain is. We don't set the poor here off against the poor overseas. We can do both. We don't set the poor here or overseas off against defence spending or superannuation concessions or a whole lot of things, but we want to set the poor off against the poor as if there's a few crumbs. That's mean. That's not what other nations are doing. And it troubles me that we in Australia are in the region where most of the world's poor live. They're a long way from Scandinavian and British and Dutch countries. Our 22 nearest neighbours, only 2 are rich, Singapore and New Zealand. The rest is the mass of the world's poor, and we've been mean. So in the Gandhi lecture, I was going to that point.
In recent times, you're speaking to this sense of, perhaps, in my interpretation of it at least, is a lack of leadership more broadly around this issue. And I'm conscious, I suppose, as someone, I'm a school teacher and I work in a school, and that's a community, and I can really see how communities can play a part with good leadership. Obviously we're talking at a national level where that can be, a greater part of our agenda. One of the more traditional aspects, I guess, of our lives potentially as Australians is the church, and we've seen some real challenges around the church and its mission. I guess I'm interested in your thoughts, Tim, on where to next for the church and its mission more broadly.
Yeah. Look, I would restructure the church in Australia and around the world on the principles of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. The inside of AA is, my name is, I'm an alcoholic, I haven't had a drink for 4 or 5 years. I think churches at their best would say, my name is Tim, I failed, I'm a sinner. I depend on grace and hand over to my higher power. I think that ruthless honesty is what the church actually needs, because that's how it began. Yeah. Saying, we're all broken, we're all frail humans trying to get by, we all need grace and understanding, and we come together weekly to support and nourish each other in the journey. Churches at their best still are that weekly gathering where you pass around the plate and take up an offering for the needs of the community and others, where you have a morally serious topic you think about and discuss. And the demise of the church is sad because there's very few weekly community groups discussing morally serious ethical issues, spiritual issues, passing around the plate. I think that is a real loss in our society. Where to for the church? Look, the church institutionally failed profoundly. Does that for me mean that the message of Jesus and that need to be honest about our frailties, to say, I judge others by their behaviour, but I judge myself by my intentions. And my intentions are always good, so I must be good. And I'm self-righteous about how good I am. At its heart, Jesus was saying, no, we've all failed. It's a level playing field. We all deceive ourselves. And at best in the church, like an AA, I acknowledge this. I find spiritual sustenance. I go out again to love, to try and transform, to be honest about myself. That's, in my view, where to for the church.
It's interesting as you're speaking, there seems to be, from both a faith perspective and a secular perspective, almost inherent psychological truths, to the many of the biblical stories. And, we were saying earlier, prior to going, on mic about, there's been a renewal, people like Jordan Peterson and others talking about, some of the biblical stories as, maps of ways of understanding, whether in a collective sense or an individual sense, important psychological truths like, having a reconciliation with yourself and being honest with yourself and trying to understand who you are and the impact that you have. And as you've just said in terms of the AA bit, that there's, I guess, an acknowledgement that we have in some ways that we're not perfect. And I guess I'm interested, Tim, in your thoughts around, what you're seeing, I guess, are some of the big stories that maybe we need to pay more attention to. Maybe some of the stories that do seem to contain inherent psychological truths. I'm conscious as well. I mean, one of the very popular secular works that came out in the recent years was a book called, I think it's about Why by Simon Sinek. It's this idea of, you really got to get to your core purpose, and it's kind of a corporatisation of, a fairly fundamental message that's been talked about for millennia, which is, why are we really here? What are you sort of seeing in the secular world in the sense of, some of the inherent psychological truths that you see reflected very clearly in perhaps some of the biblical stories?
Yeah, look, I think the secular world focuses on the question of how can we live together. That's answered by politics and budgets and rules in which we set up society. Faith and spirituality tries to answer the why question. Why am I here? How do I live? And certainly impact on the question of how do we live together. When I
was growing up, Tim, I wanted to be, a fireman or a doctor or something like that. You've grown up and you're chief advocate for World Vision. Can you tell us a little bit about what the chief advocate for World Vision does? Particularly, I'm thinking of any of the, there's some kids listening, or some of the parents. They may have a bit of an understanding, but what does the chief advocate do in your role?
Well, the chief advocate is the person who's a bit like the ambassador. I was the CEO of World Vision for 13 years and was moving on, and they said, we would like you to stay and to do a wider role. Look, for kids, they sometimes say to me, I'd love to be CEO of World Vision. How did you get there? Right. And I feel a fog descend on me. I was a lawyer. I went and studied theology in Zurich and came back and was a lawyer Baptist minister. I set up a legal practice for the poor in a little Baptist church in St Kilda. So I was a lawyer Baptist minister. I was then a mayor of St Kilda. I did such a good job, they abolished the whole council. I'm the last mayor ever. Had something to do with council amalgamations, not anything going wrong. I founded an organisation, Urban Seed, and was a Baptist minister at Collins Street Baptist Church. And Urban Seed was for the homeless, the drug affected, the street people in the CBD. I was tapped on the shoulder and I ended up as CEO of World Vision. But I've just written my memoirs, and the back cover says, I never really wanted to be a reverend, but I'm one of the best known in Australia. Yeah. I never wanted to be a CEO. I was never really any good at management, but I ended up CEO of one of the biggest charities. Yeah. I am a mystery to myself, and that's why it's a mystery to explain to kids, how do you get to being CEO? Yeah. I never had a linear plan. Yeah. What I was passionate about was both my faith and justice, and the memoir really is an exploration of that. Yeah.
And is that now out, or is it?
It comes out on the 1st of August.
Yeah, and, great.
I tell the story of where I got passionate about justice, sharing a bedroom with my brother for 17 years. And we'd have our fights because space is very important when you share a bedroom. And my father would walk in, we'd wake him up in the morning, great dad, but he'd always say the same thing. He'd say, I don't care who started this fight. Yeah. I'm not interested in the story. I don't want to know who's to blame. I'm punishing you both. That's when I got interested in justice. I reckon my brother Peter started it more.
Yeah. So a real strong connection, I suppose, to your purpose. Like you have a clear understanding of what it is that you're here to do.
Absolutely. In terms of that why question, a strong connection.
Some of the guests we've had on this podcast have talked about mentors and people that have really shaped them. It's probably a good time to ask you, having just written your memoirs. Is there someone you could share that had an effect on you that perhaps influenced your life and maybe challenged you? Because I think sometimes when we think of mentors, they're people that confirm or amplify parts of what we do. I'm interested to hear, was there someone who perhaps challenged you or that you really needed to work with, or provided you perhaps with things you didn't necessarily want to hear but ultimately were for your good?
Yeah. My first mentors, as with most of us, were my parents. And in the memoir, I reflect on Dad's very strong faith, but it was an otherworldly faith. It was really about your character tested here and now, but the aim is to get to heaven, and that's the prize when you die. He was a child of depression and fought in New Guinea in the war, and for him, and often for that generation, their question was, is there life after death? Because life is so fragile here and now. My mum, who was 11 years younger, her faith was more about changing this world. Her question was less, is there life after death, but is there life before death? Probably for my kids, their question is there life tonight? Is there a party on somewhere? So my parents were those first mentors. The mentor that probably had a big impact on me when I was 17, and he's just died, I've just attended his funeral, was John Smith, who founded the God Squad. And he was a preacher who went to the Bikie Outlaws. And
I think I read his book years ago. That'd be you have a book
On the Side of the Angels.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And I remember him shaking that faith that I sort of learned from Dad that, Christian faith is about your ticket to salvation, that you've got to book your ticket to the great U2 concert in the sky and your place is reserved. John taught me about flourishing now, about that reign of God that Jesus preached about, actually breaking in and shaking up things now. And he spoke in the Christian faith in Australian accents. He would quote Henry Lawson and Banjo Patterson, and he gave me a sense of what it means to be an Australian believer taking seriously this world now. In fact, at his funeral, having mentioned U2, Bono sent a wonderful email saying he'd heard John preach. John had taught him that the Bible is more an incendiary tract than a handbook on religion. And how John had challenged Bono that he'd gone soft, and he was enjoying the
after which album, I wonder.
That's right. So John Smith was certainly one of those mentors.
Great. So there's two questions that we like to ask everyone on the podcast, Tim, and the first one is a question about now, really, and conscious of young boys growing into men and the kinds of messages that they're getting at the moment about what it is to be a man these days, or probably more so what it is not to, not to. But I'm interested in your thoughts. What is it to be a good man these days?
So I think a good man is someone who can own the ground they stand on, make space for others, show empathy, and be someone not afraid of their emotions, to shed tears, to be moved, to be touched. I agree with you. I think it's very confusing for young men these days. How do I know this? Because I was doing research with a very fine research magazine called The Woman's Weekly. And I must have been in a dentist waiting room. And it asked women to describe their ideal men. And they had sensitive, tender men who could cook and care for the kids and totally in touch with their feelings. And I'm reading this, and then it asked those same women, "You really attracted to that sort of man?" And 8 out of 10 of the women said, "Actually, no, not really." I thought, how confusing is this for men? What actually is expected?
Yeah.
But look, I think men are wired differently. I played Aussie rules football, veterans till I was 55, 56. I think football for men is an alternative to war. We cross the field, we get our aggression out, and then we can go back to being decent humans again. Certainly that's far better than domestic violence and patriarchy and women having struggled throughout history to be treated as equal. I think my generation may be the last generation that expected our wives to cook and clean and do all that housework. I'm proud that my sons don't think that way. And they're no less men for being far more capable and sharing the domestic burden. No less men. Both are very good footballers and sportsmen. So I think for young men it is a confusing time, but to be a good man is to actually accept that you can be in touch with those emotions, and it's okay to cry. It's not weakness.
Our last question today, Tim, that we ask all our guests is if you had a story that you could share with a 14-year-old or so aged boy, and he'd actually listen, what would the story be?
Yeah. Well, whether they'd listen, I'm now so old I didn't study ancient history, I lived through it. I was actually on a tram and I saw a young woman looking at me, and the narcissist in me said, she's probably seen me on TV. And then next minute she's standing up and offering me her seat. And I realised she was thinking, gosh, what would it be like to be as old as him? Poor old thing. Look, I tell the story of when I was 14. I asked a question of my teacher that said, is poverty natural or is it created? If it's natural, you can't do anything about it. If it's created, well, we can uncreate it. We can change the rules. The teacher said in front of the whole class, that's a brilliant question. I don't know the answer to that. Blown away that I had asked a brilliant question. Secondly, that a teacher didn't know the answer. Thirdly, that this teacher took me aside and said, let's work on that question. That question became the driving passion of my life. And I would say to young men, no questions wrong. No questions dumb. And ask that question. And if you find your life question, as I did, the question about justice, stay close to it for the rest of your life. Your bliss is in staying close to the really burning question that you have that can take you through life.
Thank you so much, Reverend Tim Costello. The bliss has been absolutely ours in listening to you speak and share. We're very grateful for your time.
A delight.
Make sure you subscribe on your podcast app and please leave us a review to help grow the community. For more information about the podcast, visit understandingboys.com.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.